No, I'm joking. I said to John on a call just the other week, I said, you know, our wiring as a church, and also, you know, my natural leading just as a leader, as an individual, is to always try and make things just completely applicable. I want things to be able to work out in all of our lives. You know, what good is it if we all come and sit in churches on Sunday and then yet cannot apply any of these amazing biblical principles to our lives, you know, through a Monday? And I am convinced that following Jesus makes you better at life, and it makes your life better. And I think that those things work hand in hand. It is true that we started a church a few years back, and to be really honest with you, we didn't necessarily expect to happen what has happened, in terms of the way in which we've just seen many people come to faith in Christ, and we've seen many baptisms, and we've seen many people added to the church, and all of those things have been incredibly inspirational. I think that for us, you know, we've had super humble and small and seemingly insignificant beginnings. My wife and I, we didn't kind of grow up with the dream of, hey, let's plant a church one day. I was more than happy pursuing my career in the police, and thought that that would be a 30+ year career for me. And it's just not the way that it worked out. We had some time out in Australia a number of years back, and really we had our eyes opened to some things that we were dreaming of in our hearts, and we kind of came back and thought, you know what, we only get one stab at life, we get one shot at this, so why don't we live life a little crazy and start a church? And we did, from our living room. And when I say it was insignificant and small and humble beginnings, it really was. It was just my wife and I and a few friends, and we would gather, and literally all we would do once a week is we would just earnestly pray and ask that God would one day help us to reach lost people. And I think that just from there, we bounced around a different set of venues in town, and have encountered all of the challenges that come with pastoring a city centre church, especially where venues are concerned. I mean, man, we could tell some funny stories. People say, you know, man, if you're going to do church, you've got to have a great venue. Well, we are living proof that that's not true. We have bounced around in church in the worst venues possible. And, you know, I remember one time we'd booked this 6-month contract with an incredible venue right in the center of town. And it's not in my notes to tell you this. This is just me babbling on, I guess. But literally about 3 weeks into this contract, I heard on the radio that the entire conferencing venue was shutting down. So I rang the director up and I said, you know, hey, I heard you closing, so trust you're going to be able to refund us our 6 months rent that we paid in advance. And he was like, yeah, about that. And there's no money. And we were like, this is the money? We're like, we must have been 4 weeks old as a church, and we've just given you everything we've ever had. And now we've lost it all on week 3. And he was like, yeah, sorry about that. And I was like, your sorry does not help us. So from then we did this thing where we said, hey, we're going to go on tour. And really what that meant was we were completely homeless, had nowhere to meet, had no venues to be in. And the radio got hold of it and did this great big thing about how there's this new church in Liverpool that's relevant for young people, and they're going on tour. And we were like, yeah, because we planned it like that, when really we'd just totally fallen in to this way of just trying to earnestly try and make church happen in the not so of easiest circumstances. So I think that I say all of that to say that our experience has been a very real one, and we understand that leadership is hard. We understand that leading in church is hard, it's difficult, it's complex, and it often will bring about challenges that often are not found in many other places of life. I remember the first time I ever prayed for anybody, and this was like a huge moment for me. It felt like, right, young pastor, starting this church, gonna have a prayer line, because that's what we thought everybody did. So we went that route, and had a guy come out, and like there must have been 30 people in the room, if that. And he was like, you know, will you pray for me, pastor? I was like, absolutely. What are we praying for? He says, I want you to pray for my hearing. And I was like, absolutely. And I put my hands on his ears, and I was like, just really believing and in big faith that God was going to do a miracle and just restore his hearing to him. And this guy's just looking at me really weird with his eyes wide open, and I've got my hands on his ear, and I'm thinking like, man, I'm really going to believe for a miracle, for God to touch him, do the supernatural. And he's just glaring at me. He's like staring as I'm saying, what are you doing? So like, you know, as pastors, what we do is we pray with one eye open. We're having a look around, what's really happening, and the other eye's in full faith. Well, I said, like, is everything okay? And he just said, no, Pastor, I want you to pray for my hearing. And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. And we're going to believe that your hearing's going to be restored to you. He says, no. He says, you don't understand. He says, I'm in court on Tuesday. I want you to pray for my hearing. So I was like, oh, okay. So we've really had some fun and games along the way of just leading church and had the whole ups and downs of all of that. But I think that one of the lessons that we've learned is that life is full of ups and downs, and life is full of choices and decisions that move us from A to B. And I think that in many respects, that's what I want to briefly talk to you about. That's the message that's on my heart. I'm going to try my best not to preach at you, because I get it, right? It's Zoom. Everybody's a little bit zoomed out. We've all been doing it since March. And really what we want to be is back in the room. So I don't want to be like preaching at you. Hopefully I won't spit at you and sweat all over the screen. So we'll try and keep things pretty low key. But I do just want to talk to you about being a man in leadership or a position of responsibility and moving from A to B. A to B being wherever you are now and moving into wherever you see as being a preferable future for you. And that might be in your church. Some people are like, man, I want to grow my church from 100 to 200. Some people are like, man, I've got a life group. I've got 10 people in it. How can I get 15? Some people are youth leaders and they're like, man, how can I just get my youth leader vibes going? How can I encourage our youth group and see the thing grow and see people come to Christ? Some of you moving from A to B might be a relational struggle. Some of you moving from A to B might be, you know, man, I've got a neighbor and I really want to see him one for Christ and I've got no idea what to do. There are so many times of transition where we're trying to figure out how can we just move from A to B. And I think that that's really what I wanted to kind of just talk to you about, because this affects every man on the planet. If we were all amazing decision makers, we would never have any stress in our life anywhere. But if you're anything like me, even though I'm a pastor, right, sometimes I feel like, man, I'm stressed out, I'm worn out, I'm burnt out, I don't know which way to go. So I want to just share with you a thought that's taken from 1 Samuel, chapters 13 and 14. I'm going to assume a little bit of knowledge because John tells me that you guys are all switched on in the Lord. So I'm not going to read like the whole 2 chapters to you. Many of you will be familiar of this story, but I've always found that this is an immense source of strength and encouragement for me, whether it's been trying to lead my church right, trying to lead my family right, my marriage life right, my kids right, social circles. You guys might experience it in your work life, in your careers, your business. Like, how can we move from A to B, where we are now, to where we want to be in a more seamless kind of way? And 1 Samuel 13 and 14 in all of the scriptures is fascinating. And it's fascinating to me because it feels like it's the most contrasting passages of scripture. It feels like in 1 Samuel 13, it's like everything's horrendous, everything's awful, everything is hitting the fan, everything is going bad. Because what's happening is that Saul has got an army and they're surrounded by a Philistine garrison. They feel like they're about to be destroyed. Hey, anybody able to relate to that? Anybody feel like there's no light at the end of the tunnel? There's no hope. I don't know what to do in a situation. I don't know how to move from A to B. I don't know whether I should go left or I should go right. And Saul finds himself parked under this pomegranate tree, surrounded by this army, literally wanting to quit. Like, he wants to give up. And even those of us that follow Christ can often feel that tension sometimes, like, man, I just don't feel like I'm strong enough to keep on going. My wife and I have a saying, and we say every Monday after church, we usually want to quit. And then we grab a Starbucks on the beach. In fact, I think we stole it off Tommy Tenney or somebody, I don't know. We grab a Starbucks, walk the beach, and then decide to give it one more week. And that has been our story for about the past 7 years, I think. But Saul was in that place. He had people deserting him and leaving him, and everything is just going wrong. He expects to be killed. He's facing destruction. And then yet, when you turn the page in chapter 14, it's like the most contrasting story ever. It's like God gets involved. It's like Jonathan and his armor bearer, they get together and they say, should we go and fight the Philistines, even though Saul wasn't with him? And then by the end of the chapter, it's like God just gives Jonathan and Saul and Israel all of this incredible victory. And I think that what I've always been like is I have an inquisitive mind. It makes me go when I read that, like, how did that happen? Like, what was going on between chapters 13 and 14? And how can that impact our lives? Because if chapter 13 was like backs up against the wall, facing ruin, facing destruction, and chapter 14 was like revivals come, here's the Shekinah glory, here's God, here's like the rescue, here's everything that's going amazing now, everybody's having a party, everybody's cracking open the champagne, sorry, I meant the schlur, everybody is like having a wild party because they're like, this is amazing. It's like, well, what happened? How did that happen in just the turning of a page? How do we get from chapter 13 to 14? And it's almost like the question that it leads us to ask is, what was it that got God involved in the turning of the page? What was it that got God involved in chapter 14 that was not evident in chapter 13? Because honestly, if we can grasp hold of what this looks like for us as men, as guys, leaders in the church, it can really revolutionize the way in which we operate, work together, put our faith in God, and manage that transition between A and B. So I want to read to you some scripture, and I hope that that's okay, because, hey, we're doing Bible study tonight to a certain degree. I'm going to read from 1 Samuel 14. I'll read it from the NIV translation. Totally appreciate that many will be familiar with the story, but let's just recap for maybe anybody that's not too certain. So this is what happens after Jonathan can kind of find out that Saul's wanted to quit. He's camped out under a pomegranate tree. He knows that the nation's in a really bad and dark and seriously challenging position. So this is what happens with Jonathan and his mate, 1 Samuel 14. It says that Jonathan said to his armor bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf." I love that statement. Perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. Do all that you have in mind, his armor bearer said. Go ahead, and with you heart and soul. And Jonathan said, come on then, we'll cross towards them and let them see us. If they say to us, wait there until we come to you, we'll stay where we are and we'll not go up to them. But if they say, come up to us, we'll climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands. Verse 11. So both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. Look, said the Philistines, the Hebrews are crawling out of their holes they were hiding in. The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor bearer, come up to us and we'll teach you a lesson. So Jonathan said to his armor bearer, climb up after me, and the Lord has given them into the hands of Israel. Verse 13. Jonathan climbed up using his hands and feet with his armor bearer right behind him. Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer followed and killed behind him. In that first attack, Jonathan and his armor bearer killed some 20 men in an area of about half an acre. So that is the story of what happens in chapter 14. We've got Jonathan and his armor bearer, who, the poor guy, he doesn't even get mentioned. Like, we don't even know his name. And yet here is this guy whose lineage is such that he's now being written into the entire lineage of all of Scripture, and he doesn't even get a name. I don't know about you, I wouldn't be happy about that. I would want to make sure that my Instagram post was all about it, my Twitter feed was all about it. This guy doesn't even get a mention, doesn't even get a look in. But what an attribute to have, hey? What a humble servant, what a faithful friend, what a loyal man who was not in it for his own glory, for his own accolades, but he was there just to help his mate. I absolutely love that. So Jonathan has this conversation with this unknown man, and he literally says to him something that I think is pretty crazy. He says to him, I've got an idea. It's kind of 50-50. Might work, might not. We're going to show ourselves to that garrison over there, and if they say to us, we'll come to you, we know that we're dead. We know they're going to kill us. But if they say to us, why don't you come up to us, then we'll know that the Lord is for us. And there is just this whole thing where he's kind of like, look, I don't really know. I'm not all that sure. Perhaps the Lord is for us. Just perhaps. I love that language. In fact, it's something that we've always tried to teach in our church. Never ever make out to somebody that you are absolutely certain that God's spoken to you, because at best, what are you? 70%? 75? That language of, hey, you know what? Maybe God's saying this. Hey, you know what? Perhaps the Lord's speaking this to our heart. Not thus saith the Lord and do this right now. It's like, hey, you know what? Maybe God's for us. Maybe God's doing something. Maybe even for some of you on this call tonight, I mean, I don't know. Maybe God's doing something in your heart. Maybe God's going to speak to you tonight and give you an insight about how you can move from wherever you are to wherever you want to be. Whatever you're dreaming of. Whatever there is going on in the depth of your spirit, that you're like, man, I would love to see this come to fruition. Maybe God's going to deposit something into your soul. So we see this conversation take place. And then in the end, the armor bearer responds and says, like, I'm with your heart and soul. In other words, I've got your back, brother. Like, where you go, I go. Bearing in mind, they've not even got a weapon, right? Jonathan's got a sword, but the poor armor bearer has nothing. So when you look at it, you've got to go, it's not really a good plan, that, is it? It's like, it's not that strong a plan, Jonathan. Like, seriously, as far as you being the great strategist, you're not really there, are you, pal? Or at least that's how I would have looked at it. And yet, it was off the back of that conversation and the back of the actions of Jonathan and the armor bearer that they took out 20. And then when they took out 20, all of Saul's boys got up off their feet underneath the pomegranate tree, came running towards the Philistines. They got back involved, started to fight. Israel started to get the victory. And then the best thing happened. All of those that had previously left Saul, well, they decided, you know what? Deserting doesn't look all that good on me. Why don't we get back? And you know what's funny is, I bet those that left didn't leave quietly. Anybody ever seen that in church world? When they go, they don't leave quietly. So now these guys that had left not quietly all come running back, because now they see God's hand of favor on Jonathan, on Saul, on their armor bearer, and they're like, man, we want a piece of the pie. We want to get in on this action. And then God gives them the victory. They end up defeating the Philistines, and it's just the most incredible outlook that is now presented to them. So my question is, what got God involved? My question is, what got God in? Why did God get involved between chapters 13 and 14? Because I don't know about you, but I want him involved in my 13 and 14 stories. In the times when I feel like I'm backed up against the wall. And man, I've been there. I've not enjoyed the times when I quit my job in the police and literally cashed in my life's savings, lived off them for the best part of 18 months until we were literally broke, couldn't pay the mortgage, couldn't look after our kids, as in like no Air Max for them anymore, sacrificed absolutely everything. I've known exactly what it's like to be in between a rock and a hard place, feel like I don't know what to do, feel like there's no good ever going to come from this. I know what that's like, to feel the weight of that financial pressure. And then in the midnight hour for God to come through and do something miraculous. I know of the weight and the pain of what it's like when your loved one gets a diagnosis of cancer and you're like, God, this isn't how it's supposed to be. Like, we started this church, we sacrificed everything, and now we're living life on chemotherapy wards, and how's this going to work, and what's this going to look like for us? And we've got kids, and like, we've traveled that journey. So I know exactly what it's like to be between a rock and a hard place. I know what it's like to lead a church when you find an absolutely fantastic facility and the only barrier is £250,000 that you've got to raise in 12 weeks. And all of my friends around me said, hey, listen, like, to raise that kind of money, you're going to need at least a month, probably 18 months. And I was like, I got 12 weeks. I got to find 12 weeks. And in the midnight hour, to see God come through, like, I need these chapter 13 to 14 moments in my life, because life is real and it's hard and it's not always easy. It doesn't always run to plan. And I'm no different to each and every one of you. Some of you guys, you know what it's like to live life with the weight carrying around about like redundancy or the threat of losing your job or the business fail. You know what it's like to walk around with the shame and the guilt of stuff that you've done wrong in your past. Like, you guys all know what this is like. We're all the same. None of us are different in this. So what I'm saying is that we all need to know, what was it that got God involved when Jonathan and Saul and the armor bearer were in an incredibly difficult place? What got God involved in this? Because it was God's involvement that turned the 13 to 14 page and chapter, from a completely different outlook at the beginning to an absolute amazing and outstanding ending when everybody was cracking open the schlur. So I'm going to give you 3 real simple things that I think will speak into all of our lives and hopefully encourage us. So the first thing that we see is this, that someone took initiative. When you feel like you're in between a rock and a hard place, your back's up against the wall, you don't know what to do, you don't know whether to go left or right, you've got to do something. There's only one thing that's worse than making a bad decision, and that's not making any decision at all. It's the worst thing, procrastinating, not being able to see the wood for the trees, not being able to figure the whole thing out. Man, this can be absolutely demoralizing. It can destroy your spirit. But leaders, doesn't matter what you're leading, even if you're just leading you, your family, your home, you've got to take the initiative. And that's what we found. We literally found a conversation between Jonathan and his armor bearer saying like, hey, I've got this idea, right? It's 50-50. We can show ourselves and we can see what they say. And based on what they say, we can decide to go and fight or not. It's not the best plan. It's not the best strategy, but at least they're willing to have a go. And I just love that whole idea of how the armor bearer didn't say to the one that was taking the initiative, hey, hang on a second, you prayed about that? The armor bearer didn't say, hey, you've been fasting about that? The armor bearer's response was literally like, man, I'm just in it heart and soul. And can I just say to you guys, like whatever position you hold in the church right now at Lakeside, you know, like where Pastor Richard is concerned, if you want to know who's going to be on his strongest team, it's going to be the guys that have the ability in the middle of what's seemingly like a tough situation to be the ones that say, I'm with you heart and soul. I am with you 100% of the way. I will climb up with my hands and feet behind you. I've got your back. It is the most beneficial attribute that any man can give to his senior leader in a church. That vibe, that sentiment of, Pastor, I have got your back. So let's make sure that when our pastors are taking the initiative, we've got that same response, like I'm with you in this, heart and soul, we are all in. But then in the times and seasons that you're the one that's going to have to take the initiative, because you're going to have to, that you're going to be bold and you're going to take a big step of faith. I referenced it to you earlier, but when I left the police, it was a bit of a difficult decision for me to make because I had a great career going on. It paid quite handsomely, and my aspirations there were probably in tune with what certain people in the police had desired for me also. But I made a decision that I was going to quit. I was going to quit because we'd been running church for about a year and we really felt like it was going to take a step of faith. I really felt like I was going to have to put myself in a position where I was like, God, I need you in this. Like without you in this will never work. So I made a decision to hand my resignation in. And what's funny is the guy they sent round to my house was an individual that came round to talk me out of leaving the police. He literally said to me, hey, pick whatever you want to do and I'll make it happen for you. Tell me where you want to go. We'll facilitate it. Like, don't do it. And then I said, look, that's not where my heart is at. It's not how I'm going to do it. I'm really believing that we're going to plant a church, believing it's going to be incredible. Don't know how it's going to work, but like I'm full of faith. And he said to me, well, why don't you do this? Why don't you just take a career break? Don't resign. Because if you resign, you're never going to get back in again. Like if you resign, you're never ever going to be able to like reapply again when it doesn't work in 18 months time. He said, if you just take a career break, we'll freeze your pay and you're on top tier. You come straight back in on that. We'll freeze your pension. All of that gets reinstated, like happy days. I said, look, I'm really sorry. I said, I feel convicted. I can't do it. I feel like I've got to lead my family right. I've got to lead my church right. And I've got to sacrifice the most because I'm never going to be able to ask anybody else to sacrifice in a way that I'm not willing to sacrifice. So I'm going to walk away from a job. I'm going to walk away from a career and I'm going to put everything on the line, bet the farm that God's going to be for me. Hey, perhaps he's with me, right? That boss, he called me crazy. He said, you're insane. He said, you don't want to be doing that. That's absolutely like, you just don't want to do that. But then he turned around and he said, look, for as much as I disagree with the decision that you're making, you don't want to be doing that. He said, I might come to your church. I said, I would love to have you come to my church. He literally came week after week after week. And on the 6th week, he was there at the very back of the auditorium with his hand up in response to say, I want to follow Jesus. I was trying to preach and I'm bawling like a baby because I'm like, this is my boss from work, right? And then he ends up bringing his partner, his girlfriend that he'd been living with for a number of years. And she'd always said, man, I'm not interested in church. not going. I'm definitely not interested in the church that Luke's doing, because she was in the police as well. I'd worked with her. And she comes, and literally she comes for 12 weeks. And on her 12th week in church, she's there at the back of the auditorium with her hand up saying, I want to say yes to Jesus. And then about 6 months later, I had the honor and privilege of marrying them both. So I guess that I'm saying all of that is just sometimes you've got to take the initiative, be bold, be a little crazy, because God's not dependent on your brilliant decision or strategy. It's just dependent on your commitment to the decision or the strategy that you're looking to implement. So for me, it was, I'm going to plant this church and I'm going to invite everybody I know. I'm going to tell everybody, I'm going to ask them to come. And what I feel like is we didn't have a great plan to start a church. If I'm dead honest, it kind of sucked. If you were with us in the early days, you'd have just laughed and gone like, what are you doing? We had no clue at all. But do you not think that people would say the same looking at Jonathan's plan? You'd have to kind of look at it and go, hang on a second, right? Jonathan, your plan was to go and show yourself to a well-trained, well-armed bunch of Philistine fighting men and just kind of hope that God was going to be with you. Like, is that your best? Is that the best plan you've got going on there, Jonathan? Kind of sucks to me. But the reality is that God's not interested in the decision you make. He's interested in your commitment to the decision that you make. It's the same conversation that happens between Abraham and Lot in Genesis. I don't know if you can recount the scripture. I'm not sure where it is, but it's in the Bible, I hope. And Abraham turns and says to Lot one day, he says, hey, I'm going to go right. And if you want to go left, because their families were too big and the land couldn't support them all, I'll go right, you go left, and then everything's going to be great because I know God's going to bless me. Or if you want to go right, then I'll go left because I believe that God's going to bless me. In other words, the direction of travel was not important to Abraham. His choice was not the thing. His strategy was not the thing, because he knew wherever he went, so long as he kept God's center at the front of his life, that God was going to work it out for his good. And I think that that's exactly the same as what we find happening here. Jonathan just took initiative. And sometimes that's what we've got to do. Just start something. Take a risk, take a punt. Don't be risk adverse. Be challenged to do something different. Don't do things all the same that they've always been. Like, take a risk, take the initiative. The second thing that we see in this story is that they had this trust God or die attitude. Like for Jonathan, there was not really a backup plan. For his armor bearer, there wasn't really a great way of thinking that they could say, well, if this doesn't work, if plan A fails, we can just fall back onto plan B. It was literally like, we're going to do this. And if it works, it's going to be amazing. We're going to crack open the schlurp at Christian o'clock, 7:30. But if it doesn't work, then we are literally going to die. And it was that trust God or die mentality that I think really got God involved in the midst of everything that they were doing. I mentioned to you before about how when we planted the church, we cashed our life savings in. We literally worked on just like a couple of £100 a month and just subsidized all of our living expenses from our savings. We'd done that for the best part just over a year, and Christmas was coming. And man, like, I don't know about you, but like my kids, they want PlayStation stuff. Nike Air Max and PlayStation. If they get that, they're really happy. And this Christmas, I think the PlayStation 4 was coming out, or they wanted one and they hadn't got one. So I was going around my house, I sold my bike, I sold my hi-fi stereo, and just sold everything I could to just try and create some money to buy them a PlayStation. But I knew that that wasn't the biggest challenge. I knew the big challenge was going to come in January when I couldn't pay the mortgage. I knew the biggest challenge was going to come in January when I couldn't pay the car payment, fuel in the car, absolutely broke, overdraft on its limit. And I mean, like, I felt like I had trusted God with everything. I remember I'd turned up at a board meeting one Monday night, and you know, I was full of faith. I'd been praying. I was praying to God like crazy, like maybe tonight's the night, right, where maybe the church can just pay me a little bit more, and if not, I'm going to go work in Asda. And the board meeting passed and nothing was spoken about, and I went home like thoroughly depressed. I was doing a Saul. I was sat under the pomegranate tree, and I felt all along like I'd put God first and I trusted him and I'd been faithful to him. And if I'm dead honest, I felt like God had let me down. My friend who sits on the board as well rang me the following morning, 7:30 on a Tuesday. He rings me and said, dude, what was the matter with you last night? And I was like, nothing, because that's what us guys do, right? When we're carrying the weight of stuff, we don't want to tell anyone. We're just like, what's wrong? Nothing. What's on your mind? Come on, talk to me. Nothing. And he rang me 7:30. He's like, dude, what is the matter with you? And I literally broke and said, dude, I'm out. Like, I quit. I can't do it. I can't pay the bills anymore. I can't do this. I can't. get my kids trainers. They need stuff for PE. I'm like, man. And he said, have you told your wife? I'm like, nope. He's like, you haven't told your wife? And I was like, no, Emma has not got a clue. And he's going, dude, you need to tell your wife. And I'm like bawling on the other end of the phone going, okay, I'll go tell my wife. So I came down, I went in, I said, Emma, I said, I hate to tell you this, hon, but like, we're screwed. We're ruined. Like, I thought we'd heard from God that we should plant a church, start a church. Everything's failed. Nothing's worked out. We're broke. We've maxed out the overdraft. We've cashed in our savings. And she's like, are all our savings gone? I'm like, yep, every single penny. She's like, even everything, hon. And I said, look, I'm really so sorry. I thought that I'd heard from God. I haven't. I said, we're going to have to sell the house, maybe rent something. And literally, like, she gets upset and she's like saying to me, hey, it doesn't matter. Like, we thought we were in this together. And the more she's crying, the more I'm bawling. And I'm feeling like a right idiot because no guy likes to cry, right? And I'm just going like, this is just crazy. And then, you know, she's saying to me, it's okay, you know, we can get other jobs. And I'm going, but I quit the police for this. You know, I've left a great job for what I thought would be the perfect choice because I thought we'd heard God speak. And what do I know? You know, God doesn't care about me. Like, God doesn't know what's going on. And the doorbell's going and Emma's saying to me, you should get the door. And I was like, screw the door. I don't actually think that was my words, if I'm being really honest. It was another select choice of language. I don't care who's at the door and the doorbell's going. And Emma goes and gets the door and she comes back into my office where we were talking, this very room that I'm in tonight, actually. And she threw this A4 piece of envelope on my desk and we carry on talking and she kind of goes, okay, no worries. What's the plan? And I said, okay. I said, I'll ring the bank today. I'll tell them that we're going to default on the mortgage. I'll ring the agent. We'll get the house on the market. We'll sell the house. We'll go into rented. I'll try and get a job at Asda, something like that. That's what we're going to do. And we were like, okay. And then literally she turns to walk out the room. She goes, are you not going to open the envelope? So I grab this envelope and I open the envelope and I pull out this check that's for like thousands of pounds. And I'm like, God, in every moment where I thought and was convinced that you had left us, deserted us, left a hang on the balance, it was like there was a check in the post and all it said was, this is not for your church. This is for you and your wife. And that check paid our mortgage for the next 5 months. And let me tell you, the difference in the following 5 months were just incredible because the church started to grow, stuff started to work. And what I'm saying is, like, all the time I felt like, man, I'm ruined here. God had already prepared a way. God had already sent the way. And you know what I believe, honestly? I think that God did that because I chose to resign and walk away and burn the plow and not try and hold on to anything, not try and have a plan B. I think God did that because I literally had a trust God or die attitude, exactly the same attitude that we find with Jonathan and his armor bearer. And I think that that's what you guys need too. When you're trying to move from A to B, when you're not sure about what choice to make, create a trust God or die attitude or scenario and watch God move in your life. Do not be surprised at what God does in you and through you when you do bet the farm and put it all on the line. So you've got to not only take the initiative, but you've got to approach it with a trust God or die attitude. The third thing, and I'll be real quick because I know John is keen to move things on and do some other stuff. But the third thing that you see in this story is that their step of faith was attached to their presumption. It's like they presumed that God might be for them, but they didn't just go around talking about it. They actually took a step of faith. In other words, it tells us that they climbed up the hillside with their hands and feet, the armor bearer right behind Jonathan without even a weapon. And they then had to go and fight. In other words, they didn't just talk a great game. They put what they really believed into practice. Like they were convinced, like, this is what we should do. This is the way forward for us. This is the way. And I think that sometimes that's kind of what's missing in our story. We come to church, we get the inspiration, we get fired up and pumped up, and we can talk the best game and we know all the scriptures, but we never actually walk it out. We never actually create moments where we actually follow God and then put into practice the faith that we allegedly believe in on a Monday and bring it into play on a Sunday. And yet what we see is these guys, they were like all in and they were willing to walk this thing out. They got their hands dirty and they then went to fight. And I just want to encourage you, that's 8:50 on my clock. It would just be to say this: in whatever you're trying to do, guys, whether it's trying to start a business, lead a life group, launch a youth ministry, move the church on, whatever it is you're responsible for, change your career, just do whatever it is that you do and always be willing to take the initiative. There's a saying in the SAS and it says, lead, follow, or get out the way. And I think that we could learn a lot from that in the church, because if you're a leader, you've got to lead. But if you're not willing to take the initiative, then you've got to follow. And hey, if you're not willing to do either of those, you've got to get out the way in terms of your position of leadership, right? So lead, follow, or get out of the way. And then just make sure as you approach everything that you do it with a trust God or die attitude. Don't be afraid to believe the big things from God. He can handle your biggest, most wildest, most craziest dream or aspiration. Do it. And then whatever you do it with this sentiment that kind of says, God, I'm now going to actively, practically work this out and put my faith into action. I'm not just going to talk a great game, listen to the message, inspire myself. I'm going to follow you with my actions. For you, I don't know what that would look like. Climbing up the hill with your hands and feet, tagging onto the hem of your leader or your pastor. Whatever it would look like, just do it with a sense of going, God, I'm not prepared to just talk a great game. I want to walk a great game. And if we do those three things, I believe, and my prayer is for each and every one of us, that we would all genuinely experience those chapter 13 to chapter 14 transitions, that we would all experience those life-defining moments, like the type that you hear about in the story or you read in the book and you think that could never happen for me. Well, I believe that can happen to each and every one of us. Those differences that when you read one side of the page, it feels like everything's going down the pan, this is ruined. And then when you flip it over to the other side, it's like God's involved. And if we do these three things, I believe with all of my heart, with a full sense of faith, that God will get involved in whatever it is you're up to, because he is committed to working in you and through you. So guys, I guess that really is it for me. I'm keen on the clock and I'm a respecter of your time. So I know that John would want to do some other things now, possibly some Q&A. I'm not 100% sure. So maybe, John, if I just hand back over to you and just firstly say, hey, again, thanks for putting this on, John. And thanks for everybody giving me your ears. I hope I've not waffled on too much. I just hope it inspires you because, man, I feel humbled and honoured that we get to do this. So, John, thanks.
Oh, thank you, mate. No, that was really good. Thanks for sharing that as well, Luke. I loved it. It was really helpful and spoke to me. I can see some of my journey is fairly similar to yours as well in a number of things. So, no, thank you. Thank you. Quite inspirational. So, guys, yeah, I just want to move into some Q&A, if that's okay, Luke. So I don't know whether anyone's got any questions or thoughts about what Luke's just said before we move into anything deeper. If you have, just unmute yourself and ask away.
Hi, Luke. That was really inspiring tonight. Really, really enjoyed what you said. I've got a question about personality. For example, it's generally seen to be a lot easier for people whose personality is an organized kind, I like routine kind, I do the same thing every day kind, to maintain personal devotions. Whereas people who are more spontaneous and are just do things as their emotions dictate, find it harder perhaps to maintain, you know, regular quiet times and so on because of the nature of the personality. And the question I want to ask you is about risk-taking. There are certain personalities who are by default very cautious people who think things through logically. And then there are other kind of personalities who love jumping off cliffs because of the thrill of it. Would you say, in your experience and the other people that you've worked with and associated with, do you think that it's easier for God to use people who like taking risks? Because
Stephen,
the reason for the question is that so much of what you say, whilst inspiring, and it certainly kept my attention right through, it's also counterintuitive, because my personality is measure things, calculate things, think things through carefully. I'm not a risk taker by nature. So I want to know how you feel about that. Do you think God prefers people who like taking risks? You know what I'm trying to say?
Do you know what, Stephen? I think that is an absolutely superb question. Brilliantly put, and what a fantastic question. I think that there could be a danger on this call, and you've got to understand that maybe I get, 35 minutes and snapshot the last 7 years of my life. And it can sometimes come across like if I share some, life is peaks and troughs. And if I talk about the times when I feel like God has moved and God has done incredible things, it can almost present like that happens every single day, when I can say that is not my my story. What will interest you is that my natural wiring on Myers-Briggs is ENTP. So without a doubt, alpha male, very headstrong, know what I want to do, but I'm actually quite cautious. So I'm very hyper analytical. So I struggle to make decisions without having all the basis of facts in front of me. I am a little bit of an Excel nerd. Everybody in the office slates me to death because there is a saying with all of our staff, and they say it amongst themselves now. They say, whatever you do, don't go to him if you want to talk about emotions and feel. Only go to him if you want to talk about the facts. Like, tell him the facts and then let him try and work it out. So that's why I think that your question is superb, because actually, naturally, even though again in a snapshot window like on a Zoom, it could come across like I am a bet the farm kind of guy all the time, when that really isn't the case. But there have been times where I feel like I have been challenged by God to bet the farm. So in answer to your question, does God prefer personality types? 100% absolutely not. I don't believe that for a minute. I almost feel sometimes like when I try and incubate a trust God and die mentality, that is harder for me than other personality types, because I wouldn't say that I'm completely risk adverse, because like I say, I'm alpha male, I'm type A. So I am willing to have a punt, have a stab, try and grind a result. But at the same time, I feel nervous when we haven't understood what's happening on the peripheral. And I understand that many answers to life are not black and white. They're actually deep shades of gray, and things aren't as simple as we like to make out. So I don't think that God prefers it. I think that personally, I am not as risk-taking as maybe it sounds on a 35-minute Zoom. But I do believe that in the same way that this armor bearer, that we don't know anything about his life. We don't know anything. We don't know his name. We don't know his heritage, his family, his father. We don't know his background. We don't know what he did afterwards. Like, maybe that was his God-divine moment where he had to take a risk, where he had to bet the farm, where he had to trust God or die. And I honestly believe this. I believe that kind of question does present to everybody at some point in some stage, perhaps at different levels, perhaps in varying gauges. But I think that what might be a risk for you and then a risk for somebody else, or a risk for me, the risks may be different, but nevertheless, the leap to get us to take that risk can actually be very equal. So I would say, no, I don't think God prefers it. I feel sometimes that I have a harder time following my faith, because I struggle with childlike faith. I want to question everything. So I hope that goes in part way to your answer. But let me say this, actually, in closing. There are attributes that character profiles such as yourselves have over in abundance than other character profiles, and I would take it any day of the week, that maybe are perceived to be a little bit less risk adverse, And that's that you are going to get more out of a closeness and a relationship with God by building a daily habit that maybe to many will seem boring and insignificant than you will ever get from taking a leap of faith. Because we're not actually called to take a leap of faith, we're just called to take steps. And I believe that's the biggest step. Following Jesus daily, that's the hardest thing. Betting the farm once on a mortgage payment, when you're back, man, I know what's harder. daily devotional life. And I think that you get so much strength out of that than in many other ways. But I don't think that's doing your question justice because it was so brilliantly worded, but they would be my layman's thoughts and opinions, but brilliant question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate what you said.
It's interesting, Luke, that your example of Jonathan in this case, obviously you're a leader of a church, but Jonathan wasn't the leader of the nation, was he? It was his father. And yet you're not getting the leadership from the father, are you?
Yeah, that is correct. Saul was the king. And what we find here is that if the man, it's like I said to you before, sometimes you've got to lead, follow, or in the words of the SAS, get out of the way. And I say that because that was probably a great example of what happened here. Saul was not the one taking the initiative. So God will always raise somebody up. No man can stop what God's intentional about doing. If he can use an ass, he can use each and every one of us. He can use a Jonathan. But what's interesting to me is that Saul very quickly was able to see what God was doing through Jonathan and that of his armor bearer, got back involved in the fight, and then everybody that had deserted Saul came back to follow him. So it's an interesting observation. And yeah, you're right. It wasn't Saul that initiated, it was Jonathan.
Thank you.
I've got a quick question for you, Luke. When you was on the sort of the down and outs, there's nothing left, you'd sort of, you know, betrayed yourself to your wife, I've got no money left, what have we done? I made a big bad mistake. And then this check came in. Did you, sort of double barrel question here, did you feel a little bit like, sorry, Lord, I shouldn't have got to this stage? And did it make you sort of question yourself, any future events because of that one event?
You know, I'll tell you how I thought and how I felt, which probably sounds a little bit disingenuous, but I didn't feel like that, no. I tell you what it did for me, if I'm really honest. It encouraged my faith, because even more than the initial kind of shock of, oh my gosh, God, you hadn't forgot me. Like, oh yeah, you had heard every prayer that I prayed. Oh God, you had saw every step of faith. I was definitely overwhelmed with this idea that if I can trust God in this, I can trust him in anything. Because you'll always experience a time in your life when something happens that you just know is only God. Like, only God can do that. Like that check coming on that day, I'm quite, so I don't know whether you guys know Myers-Briggs or you do Scope or the Enia app personality profiles. I'm like 5149E. What that basically means is I am only just an extrovert, like by 1%. Really, I'm more happier in my own company. I'm kind of quiet in many respects, even though I do a lot of the public stuff. I'm more happier in the back of my house where I am now with a book than I am doing a bunch of other stuff. And I think that what it did is it really gave me a deep sense of, God, if I can trust you in this, and now I've seen you move in this, I can trust you in anything. But I think that that's the journey of faith, isn't it? I never ever got bogged down with that overwhelming sense of, God, I let you down, I should have been trusting you, like I didn't. I would have just looked at that in the same way that when my kids make a mistake, that's what I felt like I'd done. It was like, God, I'd screwed that up. I should have trusted you all the time. And I was still moaning and groaning whilst the envelope was remaining unopened on my desk. And I feel a bit embarrassed about that, but I understand the bigger picture. It was almost like me coming through that story gives me a story. And I think everybody needs to experience the faithfulness of God in one way or another, because it's only the faith from our journey, from our past, that gives us strength and faith for our future to follow. You know, it's a little bit like, I thought that money was the biggest challenge that you could ever face. It's not. Like when your wife gets diagnosed with cancer, that's the biggest challenge you could ever face. But let me tell you, it's me having seen God move in my life on previous occasions that it gave us the strength and the faith to believe that we'll see God do and move again in our lives. So I didn't feel bad for it. I didn't go and cut my wrists. I felt deeply appreciative. I felt embarrassed because I was like, oh, of course. Like we say, don't we? We preach about it, you know, God, you hold the whole world in our hands, but that means mine too. And you know what's going on in the intimate place of our hearts. You know, the deepest worries and concerns. So I didn't feel bad. I felt incredibly grateful, and I felt strengthened to believe God for bigger and better in my future. Brilliant question.
Thank you.
You appear to have, you got 4 boys, haven't you?
I got 3 boys, yeah.
3 boys.
Yeah.
So they all seem to be, you know, kind of serving in church and going on strong with, you know, with the Lord. So a lot of us here, certainly some of the younger guys have got young kids. Can you kind of just speak into how you've facilitated that in terms of taking your kids on the journey? You know, you're leading a church which presents its own challenges and problems, but how have you brought the kids along on the journey as well?
You know, yeah, and it's a difficult one to get right, and I'm not sure that we always do, and I'm not sure that we always have. It was a bit of a funny setup for us, because just imagine the scenario when you're in a church that you've been in all your life, and your kids have grown up in that church, and then you decide that actually we're going to start a church. And then you take your kids out of their friendship groups and out of their children's church type thing, and you take them to the church that you're starting and planting, and you tell them, man, this is going to be amazing. Like, this is going to be great. This is going to be absolutely off the chart. And they're like, awesome. And then you like, your first year of kids church is just your own 3 kids. Like, that's a tough sell. That is a tough sell to your kids. I have been in the room when my wife has been preaching and dragged one of my kids out by his ear because he was sat at the back of the auditorium giving his brother the V sign whilst his mum was preaching in church. You know, man, like our boys over the years have got themselves into so much trouble in church. And I honestly, I look at it and I go, I have no idea how our boys are even still saved, let alone like part of a life-giving church and all serving their heart out. I think that, to be honest with you, I think it's all about like trying to manage expectations to a certain degree. I do feel like you've got to take your kids on the journey of faith. If the only place that your kids see you being like Jesus is a Sunday, then it's never going to work. That is not faith for them to follow. They've got to see you putting Jesus first in your life. And I feel like we've always tried to do that. We've never also shied away from having church conversation when the kids are at home. A lot of pastors are kind of like, man, I try and keep our kids out of everything. Man, we speak very, very openly. We've always taken them on the journey. And for as much as it was incredibly difficult in the early years, like little silly things now, whenever we have the opportunity to travel, there's been a couple of occasions where we've taken some of the kids with us, and we always make the point of saying, hey, you know what? Like, this has all been made possible because our God is a good God, and we took some risks early on, and now we're being, I believe anyway, I feel that we're receiving the benefit of those risks that we took. So I just think you've got to live life being open. Make sure your kids see you pray. Make sure your kids don't only hear you preach at them when you're telling them off. I would probably say never ever tell your kids off with a preach, because let me tell you what's hard is when your kids become teenagers and you don't recognize them for about 7 years, and you're like, who is this alien that's living in my house? Wait until they start quoting back at you verbatim what you've said in a preach, throwing it at you in your face, because they're kind of like, and you say you follow Jesus, you stand on a platform and say A, B, and C, and now here you are being A, B, and C. Like, it's a tough and challenging dynamic, but I just think you've got to be real, and you've always got to try and be yourself. You know what? Early on in our church life, I always tried to be Stephen Furtick. I don't know whether you know him, but he's a guy out in Elevation Church. Like, he's an unbelievable preacher. Or I tried to be Paul Scanlon, he's a guy from Bradford who's been a bit of a mentor and real helper. But like, honestly, I realized that I just was trying to copy them, and I could only be me. And I figured out along the way that God can't bless who I'm trying to be. He can only bless who I really am. And I've tried to be like that with the kids too. You know, like, as they've grown older, I've always just tried to be me. And sometimes I'm the cool dad, sometimes I'm the daggy dad. I always let them see what's happening in the church. I try and let them know as much stuff first I never want them to feel like church has robbed their childhood or robbed anything from them. Many of the experiences that they now get are as a result of what we're in a position to do for church. And every available opportunity, I remind them of God's faithfulness to our family, in our life, and in our church. And other than that, I don't really know. Yeah, just do your best. What more can I say? Anybody that comes on and goes, hey, you've just got to do this, like gives you their 5-point plan about how to raise your kids. Let me tell you, it's always easy to raise the neighbour's kids. Haven't got a clue about your own, but I could raise the neighbour's kids, no problem. The real rubber hits the road in trying to bring your own up, following Jesus. But we are blessed. They're all involved in church, going on strong and loving the Lord. So I'm massively appreciative of that. Probably Emma is the reason, actually. It's nothing to do with me. It's probably my wife. She's kept them on the straight and narrow.
Thanks so much, mate. It's a good answer as well. So it's about being the same, isn't it? Off the platform as it is on, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's a struggle for a lot of people. A lot of people feel like they've got to perform when they're on the platform. You know, I would be devastated if someone were to ever say to me, man, you talk in a completely different way or a completely different style, or you dress different when you're on a platform to when you're in your back living room on a Zoom. I'll always just try and be me, because I'm not very good at trying to be someone else. I've spent years of my life doing all of that, and the comparison game isn't helpful. It's not helpful to your mental health. The moment that you compare anything that's going on in your life, you're pretty much ruining it. You're destroying it before it even gets going. So yeah, always try and be you. You will always be a better version of you than you will ever be of a phony version of Stephen Furtick or someone else. And for as much as I love all of those guys, and man, I'm appreciative for their gift to the wider body of Christ, I just know that I'm not that very good when I just try and copy them. Imitation is your biggest limitation. That's what I think.
Yeah, that's good, mate. It's so true as well. Yeah, brilliant. So just looking at the time, Luke, it's slipping away from us. So I know you've obviously got stuff to do as well. So really grateful for being with us tonight. You know, thank you so much for taking the time out to invest. Really appreciate it, mate.
Well, mate, listen, thanks very much for having us on. And who knows, hey, hopefully when we get out of this crazy COVID season, we'll be able to do something in person, in the flesh. But listen, send my regards to Pastor Richard. Tell him we're going to be praying for him and that he receives his strength back and his full health as soon as possible. And to all of you guys as well, being willing to commit some time on a Wednesday night to invest in you. I think you're doing a wise thing, a smart thing. We're going to be praying that God's best is going to be ahead of you. Thank you so much for having me on. Really love and appreciate you too, John, as well. So thanks very much, guys.